I feel so short. Can you even see me? You just see my little head. That's good enough, I guess. All right, everybody smile. All right. I love speaking at colleges. I just came from the University of Nevada, Reno. I recently spoke at the Washington Policy Center, George Mason University. I'll be going to colleges in New York and Tennessee. I'll be at my alma mater, University of Florida Journalism College, go Gators, for a student conference about, yay, freedom of information and government accountability. The conference we're putting on is funded with some of the proceeds from Stonewalled. I'm pleased to have heard from quite a few journalism college professors, not hundreds, but a few, who say that they've added Stonewalled to the recommended reading for the journalism students, or in the case of a Florida professor that wrote me a letter last week, or wrote me an email, he said he scrapped their textbook and has replaced it with Stonewalled. And I'm really pleased to hear that some journalism college professors think there's something of teachable value in there. And I love learning about the colleges that I visit. One of the interesting facts about Hillsdale, which you all probably know, but I found interesting, is the fact that it turned down the invitation to the Tangerine Bowl in the 1950s for its undefeated football team because Hillsdale's black players weren't going to be allowed on the field. That's standing for principle. So thank you so much for inviting me. In 2009, President Barack Obama pledged to make history with a high level of transparency his administration would bring to government. He issued a federal directive stating in part, here's a quote, "My administration is committed to creating an unprecedented level of openness in government. We will work together to ensure the public trust and establish a system of transparency, public participation, and collaboration. Openness will strengthen our democracy and promote efficiency and effectiveness in government." It sounds so good in theory. The Clinton years had proven difficult for the cause of transparency, and any hopes that George W. Bush would usher in a new era of openness were quickly dashed for reporters like me. But Barack Obama, here he was, placing a value and emphasis on openness that really, to us at least, in this business, set him apart. It could only mean positive things for journalists, especially for investigative journalists like me, whose effectiveness as watchdogs of government is directly proportional to our ability to access public information and inside sources. At least that's what we thought. But the Obama administration has found itself instead making history for its secrecy and assaults on the press. There's delay, denial, obstruction, intimidation, retaliation, bullying, surveillance, and for some, the possible threat of criminal prosecution. In my view, and that of other national reporters, this is proving to be the least transparent administration we've covered. It's so bad that practically every major news outlet, including the CBS News, Washington Post, and the New York Times, signed a scathing letter to the White House in 2013 objecting to unrestricted restrictions on the press that are unprecedented, that we had not dealt with before. We wrote, quote, "As surely as if they were placing a hand over a journalist's camera lens, officials in this administration are blocking the public from having an independent view of important functions of the executive branch of government." We called some Obama administration press policies in this letter, quote, "arbitrary restraint and unwarranted interference on legitimate news-gathering activities." And we told the White House, "You are in effect replacing independent photojournalism with visual press releases." We said the White House behavior raised constitutional concerns. New York Times photographer Doug Mills likened the White House press office to the Soviet news agency TASS. It's so bad that in 2013, the Free Press advocacy group Reporters Without Borders gave a serious downgrade to America's standing in the global free press rankings, rating the Obama administration as worse than Bush's. Quote, "The whistleblower is the government's enemy," wrote the group, quite rightfully, explaining its findings. It said, "Amid an all-out hunt for leaks and sources, 2013 will be the year of the Associated Press scandal, which came to light when the Department of Justice acknowledged it had seized the news agency's phone records." And they weren't the only ones complaining. In March of 2014, New York Times reporter James Risen spoke at an investigative journalism conference I attended at Berkeley and called the Obama administration, quote, the greatest enemy of press freedom in at least a generation. Perhaps the best example I can think of as to how this administration threatens loss of access to control its public message is a little story that I tell about C-SPAN. In summer of 2010, C-SPAN wanted to add footage of President Obama to a White House documentary that it produced in the final years of the George W. Bush administration. So President Obama agreed to tape a brief interview in the Oval Office with Brian Lamb, the founder and executive chairman of C-SPAN's board of directors. The 9-minute interview conducted with both men standing is pretty innocuous. "What have you changed in this room?" Brian Lamb asks the president in the Oval Office. "We have not redecorated yet," answers the president. "Given that we are in the midst of some very difficult economic times, we decided to hold off last year in terms of making some changes." All is well until about 2 weeks later, when a C-SPAN official gets a call from Obama's director of broadcast media, Dag Vega. Vega tells C-SPAN that in just a couple of days, the Washington Post will be breaking the story of the president's reported multi-million-dollar renovation of the Oval Office. Vega is calling to make sure that C-SPAN won't follow up that news by running its interview with the president that seemed to imply the opposite, the one that was taped just days before. Quote, "You're going to save the interview for the documentary, which was set to air in a few weeks, right?" Vega reportedly asked the C-SPAN official. If the public were to see the president's interview at that time, they might wonder whether he had been clueless or had intentionally perhaps been misleading about the impending makeover. From C-SPAN's viewpoint, this is a problem. There was never any agreement as to when the president's interview would air, and it would be foolish for C-SPAN to hold the relevant material only to air the inaccurate interview later for the documentary. So discussions go back and forth, with the White House saying that the agreement was for the president's interview to air in the future, around the release of the updated documentary. But with the news event, C-SPAN rightfully decides it has no choice but to air the interview sooner when the story breaks about the Oval Office decorations. The White House follows up by pressuring C-SPAN to change its mind and suggests that the cable television network will be punished with lack of access if they do air the interview. On August 31st that year, as the White House's Vega had foretold, the Washington Post breaks the news of the president's Oval Office facelift. C-SPAN goes ahead and airs the president's interview the same day. That night, Josh Earnest, then White House Deputy Press Secretary, now White House Press Secretary, reportedly fires off an angry email to C-SPAN. The biggest surprise is that he sends it in the middle of the president's live address to the nation about the drawdown of U.S. troops from Iraq. You'd think he'd have bigger fish to fry. In the email, Earnest accuses C-SPAN of being egregiously unethical and violating terms of the interview. Though there's no evidence of any existence of any prior agreement, he continues to insist the White House would not and did not agree to an interview with the president without specifying all the terms under which it would air. Earnest went on to say that no other news organization has done such a thing to the Obama White House, and he threatens to withhold future access. For its part, frustrated C-SPAN officials feel they're the ones who have been wronged. After all, the president is the one who gave an interview containing incorrect information, in which the content was almost immediately invalidated. Like a bad-tempered child stomping his foot against the exercise of logic and reason, Earnest accuses C-SPAN of a violation of trust and says they'll be unlikely to see any further cooperation for the president as long as he remains in office. One can only guess whether the Obama White House has made good on that threat to withhold cooperation, but C-SPAN's programming since that date reflects no interview with either the president or the First Lady. The message, don't cross the White House, even if it involves the simple act of airing an on-the-record, on-camera, unedited interview with the President of the United States, the consummate public official. The White House gets to direct its coverage and the terms. Good behavior will be rewarded with access. Dissenters will be punished. And I hate to say it, but I think many news organizations would have agreed to the White House demand to hold the president's interview, no questions asked. President Obama seems to be either oblivious or in denial. Or maybe he just thinks that repeating the same thing often enough will make people believe it to be true. During an internet question and answer session hosted by Google on February 14, 2013, the president told the online audience, "This is the most transparent administration in history. Every visitor that comes into the White House is now part of the public record. Every law we pass, every rule we implement, we put online for everyone to see." The Obama administration measures its supposed transparency accomplishments by the sheer number of documents published online and the amount of paper turned over to Congress. On Benghazi, the president says, "We've had more testimony and more paper than ever before." Never mind all the paper they're withholding, the ignored and denied Freedom of Information Act requests, or the fact that they still refuse to answer many basic questions more than 2 years later. The job of getting at the truth has never been harder. And in part, it's because the Obama administration and government in general have figured out how to avoid questions and accountability by cutting out the news media middleman. White House officials have exploited non-news media to spoon-feed unfiltered messaging, at times pure propaganda, into the public's mouth. The Google-sponsored chat that I mentioned, that came with a pre-selected audience and questions submitted in advance via the White House's own YouTube channel. That's the way they like it. They generate their own content, rely on surrogates to help spread partisan blogs, Twitter, and Facebook, give lots of interviews to entertainment programs, digital media, and feature press. And when they feel the situation demands an appearance of newsiness, such as a presidential apology for healthcare.gov's disastrous launch and obfuscation over it, they look for a soft landing with a hand-picked outlet and reporter. All of this impacts how well-informed we can keep the public. But also it impacts the very survival of investigative journalism. In the 3 decades of polling by the Pew Research Center for People in the Press, news organizations are near all-time lows when it comes to the public's view of our accuracy, fairness, and independence. But there's one thing the public still values the most, and it makes no difference whether they're Democrat, Republican, or independent. They overwhelmingly support the media's role as government watchdogs. That support rose a full 10 percentage points from 2011 to 2013 amid revelations about government-conducted surveillance of the public and the press. The Pew poll also reflects the public's rising concern about loss of civil liberties. If the press doesn't challenge and expose government secrecy and overreach, then who can? So back to the broken promise of transparency. One of Obama's first actions in office was to direct federal agencies to begin complying with Freedom of Information law. What a concept. No matter where you stand politically as a journalist, one had to be excited by the idea that under Obama we would gain back a major necessary tool to do our jobs. Obama said that federal agencies were to err on the side of releasing public information rather than withholding it. Instead, we've seen the opposite. A continuation and expansion of the federal bureaucracy that perverts FOIA law, as it's called, into a tactic used to prevent the release of public information, to send requests to the end of a bureaucratic queue that may never be answered, and if it is, takes months or years, successfully delaying and obfuscating past the point of relevance. I'm still waiting for lawful responses to my FOIA requests on Benghazi, Ebola, a mysterious paralyzing virus, Fast and Furious, healthcare.gov, from the FBI. Try suing over their lack of proper response, and you find the Department of Justice not encouraging federal agencies to abide by the spirit of FOIA law, but instead providing lawyers to defend the withholding of information. And they use your tax dollars for the court cases, so there's no downside for them. They still accomplish the obfuscation and delay. And in the end, even if the court orders them to turn over documents, there is no punishment or recourse. They may have to pay the plaintiff's legal fees, but they do that with your tax dollars too. It's not just me, and it's not an opinion. It's a fact and a consensus. In late June 2013, I'm flying back from an investigative reporters conference in San Antonio, Texas, and I'm seated next to another journalist, Len Downey. He's the former executive editor of the Washington Post who had just spoken at our conference. He had told the audience, quote, "The Obama administration's war on leaks is by far the most aggressive that I've seen since the Nixon administration, and I go back that far." As Downey and I chat shoulder to shoulder on the airplane, I bring up the subject of Edward Snowden. I ask Downey if it doesn't seem as though more attention should be focused on the content of Snowden's claims instead of only whether he's hiding, whether he broke the law, whether he graduated from high school. Downey agrees. 4 months later, Downey published what I see as the definitive report for the Committee to Protect Journalists. It establishes the Obama administration as the news media's top choice for least transparent American presidency in modern times. When you think of all the transparency promises, it's pretty stunning to read the actual experiences of national news reporters, not those working at conservative outlets, but journalists from the New York Times and the Washington Post. David Sang, our chief Washington correspondent of the Times, said, quote, "This is the most closed, control-freak administration I've ever covered." Times public editor Margaret Sullivan, quote, "It's turning out to be the administration of unprecedented secrecy and unprecedented attacks on a free press." Financial Times correspondent Richard McGregor, "Covering this White House is pretty miserable in terms of getting anything of substance to report on in what should be a much more open system." ABC News White House correspondent Ann Compton, "He's the least transparent of the 7 presidents I've covered in terms of how he does his daily business." Josh Gerstein of Politico, "If the story is basically one that they don't want to come out, they won't even give you the basic facts." Washington correspondent Josh Meyer, "There is across-the-board hostility to the media. They don't return repeated phone calls and emails. They feel entitled to and expect supportive media coverage." Post managing editor Kevin Merida describes what he sees as the White House's hypersensitivity, saying that officials often call reporters and editors to complain about the tiniest thing, maybe something on Twitter or a headline on a website. I have a slightly different interpretation of the administration's sensitivities and all their reactions. It's not really that they're so sensitive, they're simply executing a well-thought-out strategy to harass reporters and editors at the slightest air of negativity so as to impact the next news decisions, to provide so much unpleasant static and interference that we may subconsciously alter the way we report stories, to consume so much of our time explaining and justifying what we've reported that we begin to self-censor in the future. They accuse us of, quote, piling on, when all we're doing is accurately covering their actions and the outcome of their decisions. But what human being doesn't instinctively learn to avoid negative, unpleasant feedback? This trend did not begin with the Obama administration, and I'm afraid will not end there either. I don't really blame the Obama administration, and I don't even blame the entrenched federal bureaucracy. I blame us, the news media. When government invariably attempts to advance itself, separate itself from the public it works for, covets information, feathers its own nest, and acts as if it's an independent corporation beholden to shareholders, politicians and special interests rather than the public, it's the media that's supposed to make sure that doesn't get out of balance. We haven't been doing a very good job. We send letters, we make statements, but instead of insisting our rights be respected, we place ourselves in an unnecessarily subservient position, as if it's a favor we're asking for, something to be granted at the king's pleasure rather than a right that we're entitled to. Instead of demanding the government follow the law, we politely and somewhat timidly ask, could you pretty please follow the law? Instead of demanding access to information we own that's collected on our behalf by public servants paid with tax dollars, we make an appeal. Could you maybe please just consider giving us some of our information? And here I'd like to pause and take some questions on this topic before speaking a little bit on a related topic, how the government generates its own propaganda using your tax dollars, and why what you see on the news is so homogenous and often discourages the very original reporting that would actually get more viewers. So we'll take questions for a few minutes and then I'll talk about that. There are some nice young ladies in the aisles ready to hear from you. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Quick question. It seems to me part of the problem seems to be that we do not have a loyal opposition anywhere in this government relative to what the people want and demand about liberty.
Well, I would say there is a viewpoint, a shared viewpoint among a lot of people that even the Republican, quote, opposition is not doing its best job at presenting opposing viewpoints. And I will say that I've noticed, this is just my opinion based on observations, but also conversations with staffers and members of Congress. Like the media, there seems to be less will to do oversight, to do ask the tough questions and do the follow-through. Much like the media, I hear staffers and members of Congress saying the same sorts of things. There just isn't the appetite and the leadership to do tough oversight. They want to take the easy road. They do look into things, but only go so far, and then they seem not to follow up. So I've made some of those same observations, and I feel like there's some symmetry with what's gone on in some aspects with the media as well. I'm going to let the ladies with the microphones decide who to go to.
Can you shed some light or give us some insight on why the Obama administration is so untransparent? Do they have things to hide, or are they just constitutionally not inclined to shed any information on what they're doing? Give us some insight into that, please.
It's hard to know what people are hiding when they don't tell you what they're hiding. But I would argue it's a natural inclination of those in power to do that. I believe when President Obama said he was going to usher in a new era of transparency, I believe he meant it. I believe he thought he could. And something happens along the way, whether it's embarrassing information they'd rather not have be released, or they get inundated by advisors who have different opinions. But it seems to be that no matter how good the intentions are, the opposite happens. But that's where, again, as I said, I fault the press. If that's the natural inclination of government, it's our job as the media to push back against that and make sure it's not successful if they're withholding information that they shouldn't be withholding. We're supposed to dig and probe and push on that, and I don't think we've always done the best job at that.
I just want to follow up on this gentleman's question because it was kind of what I was thinking originally. But what I'm concerned about is this president has made so many decisions that really are not in the best interests of the United States. And that's what concerns me. That's what he's hiding. Benghazi, the national security. I mean, it just, all of his decisions lead me to think there's something very nasty going on.
As a journalist, when someone doesn't want to tell you something, especially when it's arguably public information, that's what sets off the idea that they're wanting to hide something for a reason, even if you don't know what it is. But that's certainly what keeps you going. In my case, what keeps me digging. On the other hand, I would say there's still about 50% of America that would disagree with you. And I have a very active social media account. And for all the people who sound exactly like you, I have postings from reasonable acquaintances who say quite the opposite, who think that, and you've heard it too, they still think this president is correct in what he's done, that the mistakes and problems are overblown by a partisan press and by Republicans, stoked controversies and so on. So I guess there's just difference of opinion on that.
Thank you very much. You mentioned that there is less will to do oversight, no appetite. They want to take the easy road. I assume you're talking about the individual journalist in this case, and that's certainly the symptoms, but I'm wondering a little deeper if you could give us your thought on the corporation influence on each of those journalists within CBS, ABC, NBC, you name them, all the three letters. You see some of them coming out. You see yourself coming out. I see Fox News coming out. But everybody else takes the low road, the high road, if you will, and stays away from the real problem. Why does the corporations allow that?
When I talk about taking the path of least resistance, I don't particularly mean the individual ground-level journalists. I think I'm speaking more, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, about the gatekeepers who decide what goes on TV and how much headache they want to have against these highly sophisticated, fairly recent pushback campaigns that are well-funded, that are mounted by special interests and corporate interests against news stories they don't like, and news outlets that bother to publish these things, and whistleblowers who dare to tell the truth, and politicians who dare to ask the tough questions. They're subjected to an organized campaign to controversialize them, funded by PR efforts that are invisible, so it appears to be a grassroots overswelling of opinion that's not really there. I call it an artificial reality. But it's somewhat overwhelming to the news organizations at times, who see all the social media activity and read the blogs and read about themselves and maybe don't have the stomach to push through that. It's hard to say how much corporate influence there is. There's always been a little bit of that. And journalists from time to time have to push back against what we feel may be corporate influence. But you don't always know what corporate influence is, because no one tells you necessarily why certain decisions are made. In a few instances in the book I talk about, I did have some insight because somebody said something very pointed. But in general, you don't always know why the gatekeepers don't want a particular story that seems so obvious, so obviously in the public interest. So I would say corporations and government have become so intertwined in their interests, and they become intertwined also with the media, which is beholden to, in some respects, the interests of the government and some corporations as well, as whether they're advertisers or some other interests. It's all melding into sort of one big interest. And when they all start to think alike and don't want to do oversight on each other because they're beholden to the same ideas or interests, I think that's part of a trend you might be seeing.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I was wondering if you could perhaps compare the relationship between Obama's administration and the press with perhaps past presidents like, say, President Woodrow Wilson or Abraham Lincoln even.
I don't have an answer for that question, I'm sorry, because I'm not a student of those times, and I can't say. Every chunk of press has its own relationship with the president, and there have always been adversarial questions asked. I think back to Sam Donaldson, hold on, Mr. President. And there are still reporters asking adversarial questions, even if they don't make it on the evening news necessarily every night. But I'm sorry, I haven't studied back that far.
Within the context of what you just said about a lot of reasons for skepticism about corporate America and the government, previously you commented that you gave Obama the benefit of the doubt when he said he would be transparent. What's the basis of that opinion?
Once he was already elected, to make that be a key proclamation as you enter office, without any reason for having to say so once you're already elected, but to focus so much attention on that, I do give the benefit of the doubt. I could be wrong, but my instincts say he meant it. He thought maybe that was one thing that he could change about Washington that was a problem. It didn't turn out that way, and I can't tell you what's really in his mind or his heart. That's just my interpretation.
Hi, my name's Dave Ferguson, and I'm just wondering if you know for sure whether or not this president had his college record sealed. And if so, wouldn't that be a clear indication of how transparent this guy was going to be?
I have not looked into that issue. Sorry. I'm going to try not to answer questions I don't know anything, don't know much about. And there, if you don't mind, let me go on to the second half of what I thought you might find interesting to talk about, and then I'll take some more questions after that. Okay. So this gets to the heart of a few questions you all just asked. In the last decade or more, the government has adopted and perfected many of the public relations and crisis management strategies employed by big corporations. It's a natural outgrowth of their incestuous relationship. The big difference is the government is using your tax dollars to promote itself and advance its propaganda. One way they do it is by self-producing videos and building their very own television production facilities where the upper echelon gives interviews and speeches, controlling everything from content to lighting. While the nation descended into unprecedented debt, Congress and the federal agencies, ranging from Health and Human Services to the National Institutes of Health, used millions of your tax dollars to build or expand their very own television studios. The Food and Drug Administration's facility boasts, quote, a number of mobile and fixed sets, as well as various configurations to allow for a studio audience of over 100. The Transportation Security Administration, TSA, sports a studio with Hitachi high-definition cameras and Fujinon lenses and LCD-based teleprompters. And when top officials from those federal agencies appear on camera, naturally they have to look good. So your tax dollars may kick in for the cost of their hairstylists, makeup artists, and wardrobe consultants. One insider told me that the head of a federal agency even had her fashion colors analyzed at taxpayer expense. In addition, the Pentagon has its own 24-hour channel which features military news, interviews with top defense officials, and programs such as the Grill Sergeants. While the Pentagon frets over sequestration cuts and the troops listen to talk of cutting their pensions, your tax dollars are paying to produce programs such as a cooking show competition that features mess hall cooks and aides to generals battling it out over dishes like seared ahi tuna and lamb with blueberry wine sauce. Both the Defense Department and the Centers for Disease Control provide taxpayer-funded advisors to television and Hollywood entertainment producers to promote accuracy or propaganda, depending on your viewpoint. Some of the public interest justification for use of these assets are dubious. In 2013, you may remember, Congress caught the IRS making Star Trek and Gilligan's Island parody videos to educate federal employees at a conference. When Secretary of Energy Stephen Chu resigned from the Obama administration, the federal agency produced a slick photo tribute to him using your money. It touts Chu's incredible successes, but forgets to mention any of his scandals, such as the failed effort at playing venture capitalist with tax dollars in green energy investments like Solyndra. And by its own admission, the Pentagon's Film Liaison Office gives for-profit filmmakers free use of taxpayer assets from tanks to jets, but only if the film portrays the images the Pentagon wants. If not, the assets are withheld. There was a documentary called Hollywood and the Pentagon, A Dangerous Liaison. In the documentary, they said, quote, scripts are cut and sometimes watered down. Characters are changed and historical truth sometimes fudged. One director might be loaned combat ships and jets. Another director whose script displeases the government or the Army may be refused any kind of support. Few great war films have escaped the influence or even the censure of the U.S. Army. It's pure propaganda, according to the documentary, and you're paying for it. Like big corporations, each federal agency and all 535 members of Congress have teams of taxpayer-funded media and communications specialists to advance their message. A few years ago, a well-placed insider at the U.S. Department of Agriculture confessed to me that even he was surprised to learn that his own agency supposedly had more than 1,200 employees working in some sort of media relations capacity nationwide. Department of Agriculture, 1,200 media relations employees. Your tax dollars pay for their salaries, but many times they're little more than private publicity agents for their bosses, spinning, avoiding, and obfuscating as expertly as any of their corporate counterparts. And too often, we let them get away with it. Too often, press releases that read like propaganda from government and corporations are used in the news without the required critical examination and analysis. And if you're confused about all the influences behind what you see on the news and how they affect the product, there's good reason. At times, there's a liberal political bias in mainstream media that tilts towards stories favoring liberal social issues and philosophies. But there's also a competing conservative corporate bias that favors specific companies, industries, and paid interests. Unfortunately, the result isn't an ideal balance of complete information about the world. It's often a distorted and perplexing mix. The trend has become more predominant in the last couple of years as powerful interests have mastered their methods of influencing us, and some of our managers have embraced the influence, believing they'll keep their lucrative jobs by going along rather than resisting. The capitulation to special interests may preserve these news managers' jobs in the short term, but in the big picture, I think, they're ensuring a quicker demise of the entire platform, alienating and eroding the audience that we supposedly serve. While the network evening newscasts brag that increasing numbers of people are watching, the total number of television broadcast network news audience members, compared to that which is available, remains minuscule. Many in the public believe we're feeding them a lot of pablum. I've never before heard so many people say so, liberals, conservatives, and people who define themselves as neither. So what is the mysterious process behind the decisions as to what stories make the news on a given night? Some stories are carefully chosen and edited by a small group of broadcast news managers because they serve a specific set of agendas. In a book called Manufacturing Consent, the authors state, commercial news organizations disseminate propaganda on behalf of dominant private interests in the government. Quote, the media do not function in the manner of the propaganda system of a totalitarian state. Rather, they permit, indeed encourage, spirited debate, criticism, and dissent as long as these remain faithfully within the system of presuppositions and principles that constitute an elite consensus, a system so powerful as to be internalized largely without awareness. There are other factors at play. Many story topics are selected by managers who are, as I say, producing out of fear and trying to play it safe. Playing it safe means airing stories that certain other trusted media have reported first, so there's no perceived risk to us if we report them too. We're not going out on a limb. We're not reporting anything that hasn't already been reported elsewhere, but it also means we're not giving viewers a reason to watch us. Playing it safe means shying away from stories that include allegations against certain corporations, charities, and other chosen powerful entities and people. The image of the news media as fearless watchdogs poised, if not eager to pursue stories that authorities wish to block, is often a false image. Decisions are routinely made in fear of the response that the story might provoke. The propagandist's heavy-handed tactics have worked. They don't even have to pick up the phone and complain about a story. Some news managers demonstrate a Pavlovian-style avoidance response when presented with a story that they fear will bring some negative reaction. We are weak and diffident when we needn't be. Many investigative reporters around the nation are experiencing the same thing. It's a trend. Longtime Emmy Award-winning reporter Al Sunshine retired from the CBS-owned and operated station in Miami the summer before I left CBS News. Afterward, he made some similar observations. He said, because of the recent lack of support and commitment for my investigations, I faced an almost daily battle to get the time to work on my stories and had to fight harder than ever for airtime. Though his brand of investigative reporting and consumer stories was wildly popular with viewers, sometimes resulting in new laws being passed and criminals getting prosecuted, he was told his stories were too negative. Instead, he was often reassigned to what we call day-of-air news coverage. He told me, advertisers are dominating news judgment in news organizations all over the country. The public interest is being diminished in the interest of corporate advertisers and lobbyists. What's almost universally accepted as business as usual in Washington, corruption between lobbyist dollars and political favoritism, is slowly but surely becoming the norm for many news organizations as well, says Sunshine. It might be growing worse, but historical narrative implies there's always been an element of this conditioned avoidance response in the corporate news world. In his 1967 memoir, called Due to Circumstances Beyond Our Control, CBS News President Fred Friendly expressed discomfort that top management felt over its star reporter at the time, Edward R. Murrow. Quote, During the 1954-55 season, we did a two-part report on cigarettes and lung cancer, and both CBS and CBS sponsor Alcoa Aluminum Company felt the pressures of the tobacco industry, which buys both airtime and aluminum foil. The attitude at CBS, says this book, was, why does Murrow have to save the world every week? In another instance, Fred Friendly quoted CBS founder Bill Paley as telling Edward R. Murrow, I don't want this constant stomachache every time you do a controversial subject. These tendencies to censor topics that generate objections from their powerful targets aren't necessarily spoken or even consciously addressed. Those of us who report on these sorts of subjects are not told that our stories are undesirable because they're not safe or because they challenge powers. As Sunshine said, news management manipulation is subtle. He says it comes in many forms, like withholding resources such as cameramen and producers, and conveniently dropping investigative reports from the newscast when the timing of the show happens to run too long to fit it in. We've figured it out. Ironically, management's avoidance response can result in absurd machinations that inadvertently generate the very liabilities they're trying to avoid. Some of us have boiled it down to a saying, they're often worried about the wrong things and not worried about the right things. And I'll tell you just one story that serves as an example. During the time under skittish broadcast show management my last 2 years at CBS, I reported a story on a credit card scam that showed a surveillance video of a suspect who was caught on camera, allegedly using one stolen card after another at Target, Walmart, Macy's. Neither the story nor our use of the surveillance video was precarious in any sense. The police had publicly released the video, it had already appeared on the local news, the suspect had been identified, and I had run my story through the CBS legal department for legal clearance. Even under the standards of the current skittish evening news management, this story was safe. But just prior to air, the executive producer views the finished piece in New York and rings the hotline phone to the Washington newsroom where I was. We can't show the suspect's face, she protests. Why not, I ask. She says, he hasn't been convicted of anything. I take a breath. The idea that a criminal suspect's face can't be shown on television comes from someone who lacks the most basic knowledge of the law. I'm having way too many of these conversations lately, and I know it means she's not going to listen to me. She's scared of the story. Nonetheless, I patiently explained that somebody doesn't have to be convicted of a crime for us to identify him or show his face. Under her mistaken idea of the law, arrest mugshots would never be shown on the news. We wouldn't have shown O.J. Simpson's face when he was accused but never convicted of murder. We wouldn't have identified any criminal suspects prior to conviction: Timothy McVeigh, John Gotti, Jack Kevorkian, Lorena Bobbitt, Tom DeLay, Martha Stewart, Michael Jackson, Bernard Madoff, the Unabomber, Osama bin Laden. These would all be phantom faces that we wouldn't be allowed to show. None of these stories would have been done if we were to consistently apply this executive producer's warped view of the law. Still, she balks. Call his lawyer and ask for permission to show his client's face. Another breath. I look at the clock. It's nearly 6 o'clock. Story set to air at 6:30. The odds that I'll reach the suspect's public defender and get a yes from him in the next half hour are pretty remote. But more important, the idea that we would set a precedent by asking a suspect for permission to use his image has to rank as one of the more preposterous suggestions I've ever heard. Well, we don't need his permission, I reiterate, and I doubt he would give it. I wouldn't if I were him. Okay, she says, still sounding unconvinced. We hang up the phone, and within seconds, she sends me a follow-up message telling me to blur out the suspect's face anyway. Just was it a little, she says. With time ticking, I rush back to the editing booth and break the news to my producer and our editor. You're not going to believe this, I say, but she wants us to get permission for the defendant's lawyer to use his face, or else blur it out. What? Says my producer, dumbfounded. That's outrageous. The producer makes another attempt to reach the attorney whom we tried earlier. It's futile at this hour, and we know that if asked, he's going to say no anyway. So we go ahead and blur out the suspect's face and refeed the story to New York to air. In some ways, this may not sound like a very big deal. What's the harm in masking a criminal suspect's identity? Well, I know the answer. The executive producer's misguided and capricious decision hasn't avoided risk, it's actually created a potential liability. We've now set a precedent that sets us up for accusations of bias and inconsistent treatment when we don't do the same for the next accused criminal suspect. So this is just one example of the twisted way sometimes that you get the news or don't get the news, and I'm happy to take some questions on that subject or anything else that you want to ask. We have time for questions? Okay.
We have some time for questions. Microphones will be out. Please raise your hand and stand up when they come to you. And once again, keep the question shorter than the answer might be. We'd like that.
I hate to have to ask this question, but I just wonder if you've ever been concerned for your personal safety or your life in pursuing some of the stories that you've pursued.
Thank you for asking, and I don't want to talk about that, but I'm okay. Thank you.
In the last week or so, the president did an interview with an online blogger, a young woman with bright green lipstick, and it was heralded by some as a new era of journalism. I was just wondering, what do you think this administration's target audiences are for their release of information?
Well, as I described, I think this administration has perfected the idea of going around neutral news reporters who would ask critical questions. And I don't have a problem with doing that sort of thing if that's what they want to do. My only problem would be if they do that instead of also being answerable to those who could ask the tough and probing and challenging questions and hold them accountable on behalf of the public. And I think sometimes they do more of that social media and fun stuff and entertainment, celebrity stuff, which does reach an audience because that's how some people get their news, in a way that they're not asked critical questions or they don't have an informed interviewer on these certain controversial topics. Doing that instead of doing more of the other kind, I see as a problem because I'm a traditional journalist, but I don't have a problem with them doing that if they want to do it in addition to.
What you presented seems like a great argument for limited government. Would you agree?
What do you mean by limited government?
You talked about, I think, 1,200 people in media for the Department of Agriculture.
Oh, yeah.
So a smaller government. And also you get into issues of crony capitalism. Smaller government reduces those opportunities.
Yeah, one might say so.
What's the word on the street with your brothers and sisters, so to speak, with regard to journalism schools? Are they acquiesce or push back? Second part, why does Fox kill it in the ratings every period, in your opinion?
I don't really know about journalism schools across the board. I've been thankfully exposed to some great ones and had dinner sitting next to one here from Hillsdale who are trying to teach students good journalism and fair reporting. I think a lot of people go into this business maybe not coming from journalism school. Sometimes they find their way in through a friend or a contact. They've studied politics or government. But I'll say two things growing out from that. Some people get in the business and they think their job is to convince you to feel the way they do about something. That's a different kind of journalism. That's not how I was taught. If in the end, after I've presented you with what the facts are as I've been able to find them, I really don't care what you decide. I'm not here to try to make you think a certain way. I want you to have facts that you can't get easily somewhere else. And then if you see all those facts and you don't care or you think the opposite of other people, whatever you think is fine. It doesn't bother me. I just like to put those facts on the table because those belong to you, in my opinion, and you should have those as you make up your mind. Some people want to change your mind. But secondly, I would also say, believe it or not, some of the problems I've described are not the ground level reporters and producers who do a great job, from what I've seen, day in and day out, producing original stories in an unbiased fashion. But there are key gatekeepers that shape those stories and decide which stories will go on the air and which ones will never be seen unless they're shaped a certain way. And that's more of where I see a problem. And what was your second question? Oh. Yeah, Fox News has great ratings. They could probably tell you more about why they resonate, but just what I hear from people who do, I know a lot of people that sample. So they watch Fox, they watch MSNBC, they click around, they want to hear not just, yes, people do seek their own opinions, but they also want to hear what the other people are saying too. And I think it resonates because maybe it's the only network that's doing that specifically, where there are several networks doing the liberal side of it. So you can only see, if you want to watch conservative tilted talk, I would say a lot of the reporting is very neutral, but conservative tilted talk and topics, I can't think of another TV station that you can go to, so they get that whole audience in one lump sum, while the rest of the networks divide up the liberal tilting audience. That's my guess.
What advice would you give to pressured journalists? And how has the increased speed of the internet and the use of social media impacted investigative and analytical journalism?
I don't have general advice for journalists. You'd have to ask me a question about what kind of journalism and, I'm sorry, what area of advice you're looking for. The impact of social media has been tremendous. I think some of it good, some of it bad. You can't unwind and go back from the internet. I think some people wish you could. Bloggers, for example, a mixed blessing. There have been bloggers that have uncovered amazing stories that the news media hasn't, but by the same token, you have to sit there and sift and filter and be exposed to a lot of stuff that may not be true to get to the truth. And I don't have any magic recipe, because I've been asked, to help you figure out, as we try to do, where's there a source that you can believe, where can you go, and you don't have to knock 20% off because it's a conservative site, or 30% off what they say because it's a liberal site. It's a very confusing time, and I don't know what's going to be born next. Something will come of all of this, and I hope it's something good down the road, but unfortunately, I can't foresee what's next.
Yeah. We remember MIT economist Jonathan Gruber, who wrote Obamacare with full understanding that the American people want to be lied to, and he did. Could it be that Obama also believes that we are all idiots that want to be lied to?
It's hard to say what conversations are had and what they think, but the evidence is clear with healthcare.gov and has not been well reported in my view. By some it has been, but not widely reported. I have reported this at CBS News and afterwards. The projections showed, prior to this passing, the government's own projections showed that millions of people were going to be knocked off their health insurance, that millions of people were going to be knocked off of their work insurance. This is happening now, and that's not being widely reported. It's being, I think, overshadowed by positive news. I really have no explanation for how the government's professions as to what was going to happen are so different from what the documentary record shows they knew was going to happen, but they are very much at odds. That's not an opinion, that's a fact.
Thank you so much for your time this evening. My question is going to go back to when you talked about how it's important for us to be able to make proper decisions, to have all the information really in front of us. That idea of transparency that organizations like the Sunlight Foundation have been very adamant in advocating. My question is going to lend towards campaign finance, and we see a lot of times where politicians oftentimes aren't able to disclose their information to the public. And my question to you would be, what does freedom of the press have to do with campaign finance and how that would relate to an electoral system that we have in the United States today? Thank you.
That may be a little bigger question than I'm qualified to answer, but I would say every time you get at the heart of campaign finance, what's wrong with it, how to get influence out of it, they've thought of another way around that. And one big area I'll just give as an example, even if you regulate full transparency in where certain donations come from and limits on campaign contributions and everything you try to do, people can't go straight from Congress to lobbying without a cooling off period. There are new tools that come into play that allow them to get around all of that. And one tool I think that's being widely used, I've reported a little bit on it, are nonprofits, which are highly, in my view, unregulated from the sense of the IRS looking at what they really do and what they have to disclose financially. Nonprofits are often co-opted by special interests because they sound like altruistic, sort of neutral organizations, but in fact the strings for them are being pulled and they're being funded by special interests who are in some way benefiting, in some cases, a member of Congress, for example. And I did a story on, a couple of years ago, a Republican congressman who started what I would call a fake charity that was supposed to collect money for scholarships, educational scholarships, but hadn't given out any. And he probably never thought his own connection with this charity would be revealed, and it was only revealed through a strange set of circumstances. But once it was revealed he was connected to this charity that was collecting millions of dollars from guess who? All the interests regulated by the committee that he sits on. Tobacco industry, pharmaceutical industry, and he was golfing and giving access to the people donating millions of dollars to the charity, which employed his family members, but gave out no scholarships. And this trail went on and on. This was a way, I believe, the money was started for that foundation by a pharmaceutical company, after which this congressman introduced favorable legislation and made statements on the floor. I was able to match up almost every time he got a large donation from one of these interests he was supposed to regulate. After a donation or right before a donation, he took some action or made some statement in Congress. And it took a lot of digging to find that relationship, but to me it was pretty clear. He resigned from Congress shortly after that. But that's just one example, I think, of it's so hard to find an answer to how to get influence out and make it be where people who are elected are serving just the folks instead of the well-financed interests.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you for your insights tonight. Supposing that I'm a concerned citizen outside of the profession of journalism and politics, but interested in as much accuracy and objectivity as I can find. I come home from work with about a half an hour to an hour of time to invest in that. What recommendations would you make to me about how I should use that time the best?
I've been talking about this a lot with people because I think we all have to develop our own ways. I can't say go to one site and that site will always have the news that's probably the way you want it. I don't think that exists, and yet many sites and many news outlets do great reporting. Maybe it's harder fought these days, but PBS Frontline, 60 Minutes, the networks, the newspapers, they're still doing great investigative reporting. You have to find reporters you trust, maybe on a particular topic because of some experience you've had that knows that it's ringing true, and then you may decide that's a reporter you will follow on other topics because you found them to be, in your view, trustworthy. Same with some news outlets. I think you'll hop around from one place to the next and it's not going to be the same, spend your 30 minutes looking at the same 3 or 4 places every time. I just don't think it works that way. A lot of people are telling me that they use their Twitter feed and Facebook feed as stories circulate on outlets they might never have seen. They pop through those and they find stories of interest, and that's sort of their daily newspaper of the day. They're kind of just looking around and seeing what people are sitting around and talking about. I will repost in the next couple of days something that I posted a couple weeks ago because people were asking, with some alternative websites you might want to check out that do some good investigative journalism. You may not like everything they do, but they do some great work. And just as one example, I'll say Project Censored. You can find, it's probably projectcensored.com, but you can Google it. They've made it their mission to take stories that are untouchable that news outlets, for whatever reason, for a variety of reasons, don't want to touch. And they report on those, and at the end of the year they compile, I think, the 10 best stories into a book and publish it. But these are stories you probably won't see anywhere else for a lot of different reasons, and there are places like that you might find interesting. So I'll repost that in the next week or so on SharylAttkisson.com, and you can see if there's anything of interest there for you. Thank you all.